Welcome to It's a Trap, Errors in Scripting. This is an intermediate session about scripting and how to handle errors. My name is David Gendreau. That's a lot of vowels in my name. The French stole a bunch of vowels from like the Balkans back in the 18th century. We took all their vowels, put it in my name. I love FileMaker from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I love family and business. I'm a fan of comedy. I am FileMaker Pro certified in 9 through 17. I always get my certification before I come to DevCon so I can tell people I'm certified. It's always funny that people, but that's kind of all the bona fides I say. People, people talk about, oh, I've been developing since 3 months before I was born, right? Or I'm certified in Nutshell through 21. But no, that's it. Except I do have 3 kids, and the oldest is named Neshoba, and the middle one is Dominique, and the baby, just a few months old, we call her FileMaker Pro 17 Advanced, FMP 17A for short. I do have a small consultancy, Wing Forward Solutions, and my kid drew that little picture in the back. That's Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. So this is about errors in scripting, and our goals for today is to do better error handling. The first thing is to understand the importance, right? Like why do you care about error handling? We're going to develop a vocabulary of errors. Words are important. If I hear the word strip, that means one thing when I'm refinishing my deck and another when I'm going through airport security. And we're going to recognize vulnerable scripting situations. Most errors happen in only a handful of situations. Most of the time, a lot of script steps don't cause errors. Only a few do. There are 164 script steps, and most of them don't cause errors. We're going to develop a basic model of how to write a script with keeping an eye on errors. So once we know which one of these situations, and I want to say script patterns, because there's patterns that cause errors. Once we know what they are, we can script around them and just use that code going forward to make it a habit. Okay, so why trap for errors? Number one, right? And because the name of this session is It's a Trap, and if you're not familiar with that, because ignoring traps can cause the destruction of your rebel starship. That's what happened to Admiral Akbar, the poor guy. Not once, but twice, right? In the second movie, he got caught, or the last movie. So, but really, what I'm talking about is even more serious than that, and that's data integrity. Data integrity is the most important thing for us. It should be number one. We're all professional developers here. Assuming if you're a DevCon, you identify somewhat as a professional developer. And we don't have a code of ethics as a profession. Lots of professions do. But if we were, maybe we should, if we were to have a code of ethics, the number one would be to preserve our clients' data. This is a sacred trust that our clients are entrusting their information to us. And we got to make sure we don't screw it up. We've got to make sure our systems don't delete things, that they don't change things unnecessarily, that the information they put in stays there. So data integrity is really the number one most important thing that we as developers do. And then also, there's user experience. That's really important. If we have data integrity covered, we also want to make sure that users are having a good experience, that they're enjoy using the program, it's accomplishing their goals. So there's some principles here about handling errors. And the first step is, the first thing to keep in mind is that programming is a subtle art. There are very few absolute rules. What I'm going to say today doesn't necessarily apply 100% of the time, and your style of programming may indicate something different, and that's fine. Keep in mind the goals. What I'm presenting a lot are techniques, and those can change. Context is king. That's a catchphrase in FileMaker, and it means that where you are in a FileMaker database, the table occurrences you're able to affect determine what happens, and that's super important for data integrity. Context is king is also like a wider view that how you're developing, the goals you're trying to achieve can influence the techniques you use. Users are not programmers. I recommend not giving users the ability to make choices, especially technical choices, because they're going to screw it up, right? A user sees a dialog, they don't know what the implications will be if they have to cancel or revert. The default language of FileMaker in those dialogues is really geared towards programmers. It might make sense to us, but it's probably not going to make sense to a user. If it does make sense, that's fantastic. That's a great user to have. Go for it. But for the most of the time, I think of my mom. She's 72. She's a wonderful lady. She uses FileMaker on a daily basis. She enters in payments into a FileMaker database system. And I keep her in mind whenever I'm developing any system. Like, if she was the user, would she understand what this meant? And that really helps. Access privileges are key. You got to make sure that users have access to the data that they need to modify. This is especially important. It's always important, but there's a special caveat when you're dealing with multi-file solutions. The users have to have access to the data file, to the actual fields. They might have access to something in an interface file, but if they don't have access to the data, there's going to be problems. Only a handful of script steps cause 80% of errors. And we're going to focus on those scripting situations. And then one of the key points that I want to make is that we want to make the implicit explicit. There are a lot of script steps in which something happens that isn't explicit just from the script step itself. And we want to change that. So the first thing we want to do is prevent the errors. It's a lot easier to handle errors if you can prevent them to begin with. So live development is one of FileMaker's strengths. The ability to modify a live file is fantastic. It also can kill data integrity. So my caution is don't do live development with actual users in it. So if you're going to do live, try to get the users out. There's ways of working around that, but in general, if you're working on a table definitions, you can kill a user in the middle of a script. Like they can run a script and try to set a field, and that's going to fail. And if you can handle that, you can check for that, but it's like 10 times more work. So you can trap around live users, but it makes your life a lot harder. Also, you don't want to have errors that trigger from a perform script that's been deleted, or go to layout that's been deleted. So anytime you ever delete something, ideally when you change the name, you're going to run your file, push out a DDR in your developer tools, or go through something like Inspector Pro. FM Perception is a fantastic tool. You can run FM Perception and then look at that and find references to that. I've never seen a situation where I want a user to abort a script. Like that to me, breaks my heart. Like if I see a script running and a user could just hit the escape button, when you set, if by default scripts are set to allow user abort, so that means by default a user can hit escape and stop a running script. Oh God. So I always set it off. It's one of the first. It's the first step in every one of my scripts. Comments, allow user abort off. That can really mess things up. And then lastly, we want to use some script patterns in order to manage our errors. So vocabulary. That's a tricky word to say. That's ironic. So a fault is when something goes wrong. Okay? When a user attempts to edit a record that is in use by another user, that's a fault. If I go to get some coffee and I want some half and half and the creamer's thing's empty, that's a fault, right? But it's only an error when FileMaker thinks that an error has occurred and tells us. So that's the definition that we're using here for errors and faults. So the error is when I go and tell somebody at the hotel, hey, we're out of creamer, right? So from the hotel's perspective, they've received an error message. So the record's in use by another user, that's a fault. FileMaker telling us, hey, telling the script 301, the record's in use, that's the error. And they're different. There are faults that happen all the time that don't get reported, usually because we've screwed up and not written the script right. There are errors that get reported back that we don't really care about, like if you loop through a set of records and go to record next, exit after last, the last record that's going to exit out of the loop. That's what we want. That's not a fault. But FileMaker will see it as an error, which, if run on the server, produces an error in the error log and frustrates some people. It doesn't seem, I don't see a problem with it, but you'll see a bunch of errors there for scripts that are running just fine. So, set error capture. It's an important script step for this. If you set error capture and it's off, and your script hits an error, will it produce an error back to the script? Anybody know the answer? Raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Even if error capture is off, it still reproduces an error. Raise it high, raise it high. You are all correct. It does report. All error capture does is prevent the default message. So if there's a message and there's only maybe a dozen script steps that produce messages. Most failed script steps, most errors don't produce a message. So the default is off for error capture. So you need to set it on if you want to prevent those messages. And as I said earlier, we don't really want users making decisions, which isn't a big deal. Lots of times it's just a notification. But also the language that FileMaker uses isn't always the greatest. So I like to replace those error messages with my own. And then these are two different error messages from the same script step, perform find. But they're different because what caused them is different. So the message they get depends on the actual error code itself, not just the script step. And then there's a function called getErrorCaptureState. If you want to work through a script and preserve the error capture, you can do that by checking what the error capture state is, capturing it, and restoring it later. GetLastError is a function that returns the error code of the last script step. It is the key to error handling. This is my favorite function. Do you all have favorite functions? This is my favorite one. Obviously, I'm doing a DevCon presentation on it. Okay. Error trapping, when I talk about trapping, really I'm saying that means you're capturing the error and then you're handling it in some way. And for handle, you can resolve it, right? So not all errors need to go to users. You can script after it and work around it. Or you can report it. You can tell the user that something unusual has happened. Sometimes you can actually that choose one is wrong. You can do both. You can just handle it and at the end of the script say, hey, just so you know, something happened. Once in a while, you may need to ask for user's input in order to know what to do next. Yes, exactly. The gentleman just crossed himself because we were asking a user to make a decision, which I recommend against, but I can imagine situations where that's important. Okay, so vulnerable scripting. Most errors are going to be a result of one of these 4 situations. Okay, if you handle these 4 situations, you may never see another error mess up your data again. Found sets, if you perform a find, those can break in a few ways. They can break because there's no records found. That produces an error. If you put in data, if you have an empty find, if you put in data that doesn't match the field validations, if it's a date field and somehow you put in text, that'll break a find. Editing records, this is like the most interesting one. Whenever you try to set a field and change data, that's probably going to cause more errors than almost anything else that will actually affect your data integrity. File paths and send mail are both cause a lot of errors, and they do because they're dealing with outside systems. With your file paths, you're dealing with the OS. And so you got to make sure that if you're exporting, that the file name matches the requirements of the OS. Can you start a file name with an exclamation point or a question mark? I don't know. I certainly wouldn't try, because it's likely to fail. Same with exports. Imports and exports. Imports, maybe that file is missing. So that will cause errors in imports when you're dealing with file paths. And then send mail, the same thing. You're dealing with an outside system, email server. You got to make sure the username and password is right. You got to make sure that the port's configured. There's all this stuff around working with outside systems. So, first case, send mail. You're dealing with an outside system. This is the easiest thing, so I'm just going to run through it real quick. You're dealing with a mail server. There's different failure points. If your credentials are wrong, or your port's misconfigured, or if the email server's having a bad hair day, that can all cause failures. And there's also false positives. I know from personal experience that Gmail, if you're using Gmail as a mail server, it will sometimes bounce you back an error, a 1506. And that means something happened. But it'll bounce that back even if it successfully sent the mail. Nobody knows why. It's a mystery. It's Google. What are you going to do? So, one way to handle the primary thing, if you've never handled an error before. Oh, by the way, real quick. This is a list of all the errors there are. There's so many errors, 256 of them. I've probably seen 30 of these in real life. But they're here. It's handy to know. And then the other thing is that this is a list of all the script steps there are. All organized by category, the found sets. The ones that do need care are ones that deal with a file path. So when you're dealing with these script steps, that's a file path. When you're dealing with records, set fields, open records, commit, found sets, and send mail. Go to record is that special case where we don't really think that's an error. Now, let's see. Okay, so we have some people in our database, and we want to send an email, a birthday email. And we're going to send it to, whose birthday is today? What day is today? Oh, is it the 8th? Yeah, it's the twins' birthday. Leah and Luke have the same birthday. They're twins. It's easy to forget that, right? Because Star Wars, like Leah seems so much older than Luke. Right? Like she seems like Luke's sister by 10 years. But they're twins. I'll turn the script debugger on, send a birthday email. I've not turned error capture on. We're going to set some variables, basically the subject, body, email address, and we're going to send this mail via an SMTP server, which I have not configured. So we get an error. The connection is refused by the SMTP server because it doesn't exist. Gives us an error down here. returns the error to the debugger. You get to see when you have the debugger on, the debugger is such a great tool. Oh my God, if you don't have advanced, well, I think everybody has advanced now, right? Use the debugger all the time. It's so helpful. So it gives the error right there in red. We're going to change the script a little bit. That was kind of a weird error message, right? It gave us some information, but if you're my mom and you see that, what does that mean? I mean, she'll then call me up or call the system administrator up and say, hey, what does this mean? Or she'll Google it, and that won't help her. So we want to give a little bit of a better message. So we're going to turn error capture on. And we're going to capture that error in a variable. So error capture's on. So now we actually, like I said before, we don't need to turn error capture on to capture the error in a variable, but we are turning it on to suppress the default message. We're going to capture that. In mail error, I like to use variables to capture errors. You could use, in this script, I could just say, instead of if mail error, I could say if get last error. But by putting in a variable, you're able to use it later. Each subsequent script step will clear the previous error, with the exception of a few control steps, if, else if, exit script, those will clear it. But here we're going to capture it, and if that mail error is true, we're going to show them custom dialog. Okay? And birthday email. Here's some lengthy explanation, but it's a lot clearer for the user. The email encountered technical difficulties. Try again in a minute. If you continue, email this with the error code, right? So it tells the user what to do. It's not just there's a problem. It's there's a problem in like normal language, and do this. Try it again. If it still doesn't work, do this other thing. Email, and we'll handle it. And that is so much better for the user. This is that's an error code 1502 because I didn't put anything in there. But like I was saying, Gmail will sometimes give you a different code even when it's been sent. And what that gets us into is that the actual code numbers, once you're doing this basic stuff, the actual code numbers can matter. So what you can do is you can set the code, and now I've set the mail error variable. If you check over here under currents, it's 1502. If it's a 1502, it'll do something, but if it's a 1506, they'll get a different message. They'll get, which I can't, well, here, let's do this. I can't replicate that because it's pretty spotty, but when it does happen, you guys notice what I did there? I changed the variable in the script debugger. So you can do that when you're testing. You can actually manipulate script variables and global variables in the debugger itself, which is super handy when you want to demo an error that you can't reproduce. Now, this is a slightly different error. Can't be sent. Check your sent items, because maybe it may not have been sent, okay? So if it hasn't been sent, go ahead and do it again. It gives a little more information, and we're using our expertise as developers to help users. It's a much better experience for them. Okay, so that was sendmail. That's basic error handling. Is you suppress the default message, you introduce your own message, and you customize your message for the user, for the context, and also for the specific error if that makes a difference. The three other places where you want to check for errors, after performing a find, before you start editing a record, and when you're done editing a record. Here's an example. This is a script that enters find, sets a field, performs it, and then deletes all the records. You almost never want to do that. But there are times when you do. Delete all records is actually a handy tool because it's transactional. If you try to delete all records and one of those deletions fails, it rolls it all back. That's cool. But say you wanted to do that. And I'm using this for dramatic effect. What happens to this if the record you're on doesn't have a birth date? Or what happens if you're in find mode when this script runs? What's the result? Does anybody know? The correct answer is if you have an empty find request, what's your name? Mike? If there's no find request at all, this is different than if you found, if you had a date in there that no one had. But if you have an empty found set, it restores the previous found set. So if you're looking at 3 records out of 100, it deletes 3. It'll delete 3 records. It won't show them all. It won't show nothing. It'll show the previous found set. That's what happens. And that's a frightening thing. So we want to make sure that after we did a find, that resulted in something before we carry on. And it's not just delete. It could be set field, right? So if you have a set field, you want to find this and set the field. Well, you just found 3 records that don't match this criteria. You just found the last 3 records. And now you're setting the wrong field, and you're hosing data integrity, which is our sacred trust. So we want to make sure that that find did not fail. Let's delete all with shared birthday. Sorry, Luke and Leia. Perform find. She did have a birthday, so we found 2, and that's great. We don't want to delete all. But if we were on Han, and nobody knows Han's birthday, you know, because he's like got no parents, he's solo. And to kind of demonstrate what I'm trying to say, let's omit General Mothma here, hero of the Battle of Endor, and let's try this, delete all with a shared birthday. We're going to step through here, and we're back to our 3 record found set. So, and we have an error, the find criteria are empty. Now if we have an error 401, that nothing matched that, that would show 0 records. So the error codes do matter. And it might seem overwhelming because you're dealing with these like 400 and 401 and 301. But there's really only a handful of situations and maybe 8 or 10 codes that this matters for. We don't want to delete them all. What we want to do is we want to write a script that doesn't stink. So we want, oh, you know what I'm going to do first? I'm going to run through, that's the error there. Let's do this. Most of the find-related errors are going to be a 400 or a 401. Like I said, there are some other random ones that pop up if you try to put text in a date field. The other most common error that you can get, I'm going to show you how to resolve that perform find error after I go through the other 2, and we'll just try to knock them all out together in one batch. This happens all the time, right? In a multi-window solution, in a shared hosted file, you can lock records. If I start editing a record, open a new window, that record is now locked for me. If it's on a host, if somebody's using a record, if they've clicked in there and typed anything, that record is now locked for all other users. And we'll get this if it's on the server. We'll get a different message by default if it's yourself or if it's local. But this is a common error. And your scripts that you've set to run will encounter this if it's a hosted solution. There's really it's really hard to avoid this. So most of those errors are going to be in use 301. Oh yeah. Okay. Perform find. Open record. This is what will produce an open record, a record in use error, right here. Right? There's no open record here. This is just set field. When you set a field, if you're working on a new record or a record that has not yet been opened, there's an implicit open record at the beginning of this. So trying to open a record or setting a field will have the same effect, or deleting it will have the same effect. You're opening it, you're claiming it, you're bringing it into your domain. So since open record is implicit in a set field, we should always start with an open record. Whenever you come to a record, open it and then check. It's a lot better than trying to set it and check afterwards. Okay? Open your record first, check to see if there was an error, if it's in use. So the open record's implicit in a set field. Cool little, quick little breadcrumb Easter egg. There's this function get last external error detail. In the past, we couldn't know, the script couldn't know, developers couldn't know who was using the record. Now we can. This function has been updated, I think in 16, to include who's actually using that record, which is cool. Before it was just, this record's in use. Now you can say that Darth Vader is using this record. Okay, here's another one, right? If you have a validation on an email field that your emails have to have an ampersand, somebody enters an email address, a URL as an email address, seen that dozens of times, you'll get an error. That email address is defined, that's a validation error. I'll give you choices, which is OK or revert record. Again, that's the default. And what are users going to do with that? What does revert mean? To my mom, she doesn't know what revert means in this context. And once you hit OK, FileMaker is saying go back and change the data. But it doesn't say that. So if you hit revert, the data will go back to where it was before you opened it, which will allow the script to continue, but hitting OK won't get you anywhere. It'll just get you back there where you got to edit it. It's possible that field isn't even on that layout if this is a script that's running a bunch of steps. If it's not a user layout. This, can we see that? These are all commits. You open a record. Once you open a record, if you change the context, if you go to another record, if you enter find mode, I don't like that. If you go to a different layout, each of those things you're doing, when you change that context from mode or layout or record, there's an implicit commit. So when you do that, you're committing the record. FileMaker does that automatically. You don't put the commit there, but you should. We want to make the implicit explicit. So anytime once you're done editing a record, close it explicitly, commit it, and then you can check for errors. You could theoretically check for errors after you go to a record, after you enter find mode, but that's a bad idea. It's a terrible idea. It'll cause the destruction of your Rebel Starship. Because there are lots of ways to generate errors, you can change mode, and that can trigger a script. And an error from that triggered script will carry over into the parent script. So if you have a perform find in a triggered script, it'll show up here in your parent script. So we want to explicitly commit and then capture. Most of the time, pretty much all of the time, every time, a commit is, if it's going to throw an error, it's going to be a validation error. I'm trying to think of a situation when I've seen, anybody know of a situation where you might commit something and it's not a validation error? I mean, that's what you got to worry about is validation. And if you're worried about having too many commits, just be aware that committing a record does have a bit of a performance thing. You're committing it, but that's going to happen anyway when you change your layout. And if the record has never been opened to begin with, you can't commit it. A commit will just not do anything. It won't add any performance hit to it. Okay, so now that was those common errors. Basically, when you're finding and when you're editing records, make the open record and the commit record explicit. You want to always check for an error after a perform find. Don't see if that it found anything. Don't check for a found count, because we just saw that having a found count doesn't mean you found the right records. Check for an error. When you edit, make sure you always open it and always commit it and check for errors after each. For example, this is a pattern you can use before you finish a script or change mode or change your layout or even make a new window. Closing windows causes that. New windows actually don't cause a commit. So first thing you do is you open it. Grab that variable. Grab that error into a variable. I like using specific named variables. This is my open error, in case I want to go back and check later. You could use just $error, but if you've got a few different things happen in the course of a script, you don't know which one it necessarily is causing. You could probably figure it out, but it's a lot easier to use separate variables. Right? When they see after that error, if that error is true, if it's not 0, show a custom dialog, and then exit the script. Or do what you wanted to do. You've opened the record, now set the field. You want to set this person's birthday to today. And then when you're done, you close it, and you check. Is there a commit error? If there is, show the dialog, and give the user some options. And then you can navigate away. Now, if you notice here, we'll come to this, but there's what you do, and then there's these kind of cleanup steps. Go to layout, exit script, go to layout. We'll talk if we have time, I'll talk about how to reduce the cleanup. I'm not sure if we're going to have time. Let's see what happens. Now, with these patterns, there's two problems that can come up. One is, where are you in this scripted process? If this is just like a one-time set field, not that big a deal. You can show the user an error message. But if this is going through a bunch of related records and doing a bunch of more complex scripting, well, then our skill as developers come into play. That's when we need to figure out, like start doing the math and the puzzle. And what happens now? We're in the middle of the script. This record can't be modified. Somebody's using it. What do you want to happen? Do you want to roll everything back to where it was? Do you want to give a notice at the end of the script and say, hey, this all worked except for this one thing? You got to double check that. Do you want to loop and try it again for a couple seconds and see if you can resolve it within the script? So those are considerations that you need to take when you're dealing with a more complex script. And then, and what should happen after a specific error? Like a specific error, what do you want to happen after if you do a find and nothing is found versus the find criteria was bad? how do you handle those differences? If you do a find and you get an error 400, which means no records were found, if you did a find, the find was fine, it was structured fine, there was just nothing there, well, lots of cases that's okay. Somebody hits an update these records button and it doesn't find anything, you can tell that you don't even have to tell the user that it didn't. It updated everything it found, and that's great. So once you've kind of established that you're capturing these errors and you're handling them in some way, it's good to know that they're happening, right? As developers, one of the benefits, the one benefit to having error capture be off in any situation is that users will see an error message. They'll know in some situations that something bad has happened. But lots of times users don't tell anybody, right? I mean, I know from experience, like I've been in operating systems, I've been using, say, Windows, and there's an error message. I don't know what that means. Click, okay. I don't tell anybody. I just moved it out of the way, and everything seems to be working, right? So it's not a bad idea for users to see errors, but they have to actually communicate that to you as a developer and say, hey, there was a problem with this process I ran. Or you can tell yourself. You can log scripts. You can log errors. You can write them to a table. You can send an email to yourself. You can do both. So as part of your, like FileMaker server does that naturally. It logs those errors server side. A basic log table is, I'd recommend you want to absolutely capture the error and the account name, timestamp, script name, layout name. You want to capture those things. Like where did these errors happen so that you can go back and diagnose what the issue was. To do that, it's a little tricky. Not too bad. Because, let's see, log error. So you need to, when you, as part of your error trapping setup, I recommend doing this on server. Doesn't have to. I like the idea that if there's an error, if there's a commit error, perform my log script and do it on the server, because this isn't something the user has to care about, and it's really lightweight. And there's some concern about running too much on the server. Perform script on server is fantastic. There can be a tendency to overload server with stuff, but for this, it's super lightweight. Just run a script on the server. You got to pass it the parameters from the current context, the script name and the layout name. Because once you call that script, the script name is going to be itself. So if you didn't pass it as a parameter, you would never know what script the error ran in. It would always just be your error log script, and same with the layout. So you pass it some parameters, and I'm doing very basic parameter passing here of layout name, script name, commit error, using value positions. You should probably use JSON, or there's some better tools for passing parameters these days. There's even a session on it, I'm pretty sure. And so, where's my error log script? So my error log script is going to run on server. It's going to grab these variables from the parameter. It's going to make a new record. I also have it here. It's also going to send an email. So that can be overwhelming depending on your usage. You could get 7,000 emails a day on things like finds that didn't find anything, and that's totally fine. But those are choices you have to, those are tools you have, right? Error logging is super helpful. You should all be using logs. It helps to see patterns if people are having problems in the same places or certain users are always having problems. You could do a real good eyeball analysis just by scanning a log. We got about 15 minutes left. For those, anybody here look at the error logs on their server? And does it drive you nuts to see the go-to error next, exit after last error? Yeah, right? Yeah, there's a feature request to have that removed to be able to turn off which errors get logged. This is an easy way of bypassing it, right? Instead of using it's just a couple extra lines, you check to see if you're at the end of the script or not in an if statement, and if you are, you exit. Personally, it doesn't bother me. I can just ignore things, like put my blinders on, but I understand that it irritates people. So this is a common pattern. This is a scripting pattern you can use to prevent FileMaker from reporting errors, specifically geared towards FileMaker server and logging. This is a little more advanced stuff to talk about. I think we got a couple minutes here. If you're in the middle of a complex find, you're going to do a find and you're going to find a bunch of records and loop through them and set the field, right? There's a problem that you can have, and that's if those records are interrelated somehow. So say you have an invoice with line items. You want to apply a discount to all those line items and then update the invoice total. You go through your line items, you update those discounts, but one of those records is being used by somebody else, right? That's a problem. Do you not update that and just finish it and update your invoice and your totals are off because one of those line items doesn't have a discount? That's a possibility. You can do it that way. It's probably not the best choice because you've hosed your data integrity, right? You destroyed your Starship. People thought they updated the items and they didn't. There's one missing. There's something called the transactional approach to scripting, in which once you start doing a series of interrelated updates, that either they all update or they all get rolled back. So if you run into a locked record, everything rolls back. That's cool. Beyond the scope of this session, I recommend everybody eventually gets there. It's really a great tool. Is anybody doing transactions now? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Your Starship thanks you. Check it out. And again, like, just start small. Let's make incremental improvements. Single pass loop. If you noticed over here, there was a lot of cleanup steps, right? So here we are. We're doing a bunch of error checking. And if any one of these things go wrong, we got to do something. We got to go back to the original layout. You know, maybe we got to clean up some other things. Maybe we got to clear a global variable. Maybe we got to clear a global field. Instead of repeating this every time, and whenever we repeat ourselves, we introduce the possibility of errors. There's something called a single pass loop, which is a really great idea. And it uses, let's see if I have it here. Yep. You basically put everything inside a loop. And you exit that loop whenever there's an error. So it's the same script, except I took all the cleanup steps out. And what I did instead is that when there's an error, exit the loop. And at the bottom, you exit the loop, it's true. And then you do your cleanup steps. Right? Google that to learn more. Don Hetty, I believe, is the person who came up with that or popularized that. People use custom functions to handle errors, to capture the state of the script and just pass that into an error logging script. Google custom function and errors, and JSON makes all of this data handling a lot easier. Check out other people's work. Break it open. Do you guys know that the devcon to go file you have on your computer, you have full access to? You have developer access to. Claus wrote this, and you can break it open, and you can look at what he's done and how he handles things. Super cool. He's got a cool custom function that checks to see if a layout exists before navigating to it. Very nice. And if you, does everybody know how to do that? How to break open, get developer access? It's very simple. There's the 3 little dots on the devcon to go. Down here, more developer tools. Unlock this app. And it automatically logs you in, admin devcon. And now, what happened? Nope. I did something. Oh, turn debugging off, that's right. Oh, maybe I have the debugger on, no? So here's the script. This is the startup script for the DevCon to go file. How cool is that, right? You can see what's happening. So Claus wrote a nice intro, and he's got a whole bunch of scripts here you can flip through and check out. We're going to finish it up here. Does anybody want to do any questions? Does anybody have any questions they want to come up and ask? If not, I'll just talk for 5 more minutes. That's fine. If you do want to talk, there are mics over there.
I just wanted to, thanks by the way, some really good tips there.
You're welcome.
I also just wanted to mention one other area where errors are really common, which is insert from URL. And sometimes you'll get an error back from it, but often the error's embedded in the response. So you'll have to parse that. I wondered if you had any techniques for that.
I don't off the top of my head. I have run into that. Again, we're dealing with outside systems, so you got to make sure that your syntax, this is not FileMaker syntax, your syntax has to match whatever the API is. So you got to check that. I don't have any good ideas for that off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, it is tough.
Yeah.
I downloaded the traps file from DevCon to go, and it's password protected.
Yeah, I'm going to update that in the next half hour. So after this is done, I'll just download it again in about an hour, and it'll auto log in. Sorry about that. There's further information out here. If you want to take a picture of this, FileMaker Standards does great stuff. The Selenium blog has some things, and Todd Geist is always the king. Yes?
We had a really hard to find bug, and I think what you've taught us would have avoided it, but I wanted to bring it up. There was a 500 line or so script, and about halfway through, there was a commit which changed the data state. And it took us hours to find this, several developers trying to figure out what was going wrong. And I don't know if I have a question, more just if you've ever seen or if you have a strategy for getting out of such situations like bad code where there's a implicit commit happening halfway down.
Dealing with other people's code is always tough. You'll make your fellow developers and yourself, you're a fellow developer of yourself, who have to look at your file later a lot happier by making these implicit things explicit. FM perception, if you inherit a legacy file, kind of go through and find go to layouts and mode changes and see if you can just throw in an explicit commit there and an error capture. It can be a lot of work, but that's the legacy life.
Less time than it took us to figure out what was going on.
Right, and you keep your data integrity and your Starship flying. Yeah.
Yep.
Not so much a question as a quick comment on your logging script. Just a warning, the script itself is super lightweight, but if the schema in your file is heavy, that takes time to spin up that session on the server. It might be a good thing to put in a totally separate file and keep that weight off the server, and then it'll get in and out more quickly.
You're talking about on the logging?
On the logging script.
Yeah. So there are a couple things I didn't include, one of which is escaping triggers and using layouts that are just based for scripting. But if you guys are running scripts, I got 3 minutes, right, Lori? 2. If you're running scripts, if you're running triggers, if any triggers firing, whether it's first window open or layout triggers, you should have an escape. You should have if triggers are off, exit script, end if at the beginning of each of those, so that you always have the option to turn them off, because triggers are a bane for error capture, and they can also perform a performance hit every time you try to log on to the server. You're doing a performance script on server. Just let it run. Don't worry so much about the opening stuff. Most of that opening stuff is user-focused. Yes, thank you.
Precise list of which script steps do and do not clear the last error?
Yes. It does. It says it. I think in the get last error actual help, the function help page, it says that, and it's the quote control script steps, which is if loop exit halt script. Anything else? Final notes, session updates. That's not true. There will be updates. I will update that file. There is, did I skip the page for evaluations? Please evaluate this session. I left my tip jar in the room, so I know FMI really loves it when when you put the tip jar out. No, there is a page, a link to evaluate. It's really important. If you like this, let me know. Let FileMaker know. Oh, it was attached to that, the thank you slide. Okay, cool. So again, thank you all very much. I had a great time talking to you. Have a great rest of your conference. Take care.